Today, we are grappling with a core paradox of the modern age: technological progress. On the surface, invention is universally celebrated. More efficient, more advanced, more connected.
Always better, right?
That's the assumption. But if we look closely at the systems we've created, our sources suggest a much darker narrative. The very forces driving progress also carry an inexorable downside, a deep-seated tendency toward dystopia.
I found a powerful quote in the material from John Leonhardt. He's a cultural historian of engineering. He describes invention as a powerful river that cannot be dammed or deflected. It's driven by this almost animal, instinctual impulse, constantly raging against equilibrium. So the question they have to ask today is, when this relentless forward momentum, which is designed to liberate us or make systems flawless, actually delivers new forms of systemic control or division or even suffering.
Right.
What went wrong?
That is precisely our mission for this deep dive. We are going to analyze the mechanics of systemic failure.
Okay.
We want to understand how conceptual, physical, and biological systems, all designed explicitly for optimization or total improvement, seem almost destined to produce negative, often highly unforeseen consequences. We'll look at everything from urban planning and standardized time to genetic engineering and deep psychology to figure out why the path to utopia so often turns out to be a detour to peril.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of perfection leading to peril.
Yeah.
Because we instinctively assume that better technology equals a better future. But you mentioned there's a specific bias that underlies this failure mode.
We have to tackle the psychological barrier first, and it's something called the nirvana fallacy, this unrealistic bias of aiming for perfect technology. What's critical for you to understand is how this focus on a flawless, grand design actually introduces risk. Well, engineers are constantly chasing the most ambitious, complex, end-state solution. In that chase, they often overlook viable, simpler, or what you might call suboptimal designs that might actually be far more robust and resilient in the real world.
So the complexity itself is the liability.
It is. The very ambition of these great engineering designs, because they rely on so many moving parts, so many assumptions about human behavior, they often become, as the sources say, the foes of reasonable suboptimal designs.
Wow, I see.
They introduce massive, hidden, systemic risk into society. Think about it. A complex digital system designed for absolute efficiency might have a single point of failure that a more redundant, simpler, maybe slightly less efficient analog system would never have had. The relentless pursuit of maximum efficiency is often what ensures maximum fragility.
Okay, so we see this failure mode play out really clearly when we examine, I guess, the oldest and most imposing systems we've ever constructed. Our cities. These huge, large-scale projects were supposed to organize chaos and promote equality, but they frequently ended up delivering division instead.
The perfect foundational example is the fundamental grid of the United States, the Jeffersonian Grid.
Right.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just a map, it was a whole socio-political blueprint. In the chaotic aftermath of the Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson proposed this incredibly ambitious, but also simple and egalitarian vision.
Which was what, exactly?
Subdividing all the newly acquired Western territory into uniform, equal-sized plots, specifically 36-mile square townships.
So this was a way to create national stability fast.
It was both financial and philosophical. The goal was to promote an egalitarian nation built on independent family farmers owning their own land, which would strengthen the Republican ideal.
And pay the bills.
It was the fastest way to sell vast amounts of territory to pay off war creditors. It allowed a buyer in, say, Boston, to feel completely confident purchasing a standardized plot, sight unseen, out in Ohio or Indiana. The abstract system was designed for fairness and for rapid growth.
But the flaw in the design was astonishingly fundamental. I mean, it's almost funny.
It was a direct conflict between abstract geometry and physical reality. You could literally call it a rounding error.
Right.
The plan was predicated on strict, perfectly straight north-south and east-west lines. But, as our sources point out, you cannot actually impose a large grid of equal-sized squares onto a spherical planet. The lines of longitude, they converge.
That is physics just clashing with abstract idealism on a grand continental scale. So how did they solve that incompatibility in practice?
Well, solved is a strong word. To compensate for this massive physical problem, surveyors had to introduce grid corrections.
So what does that look like?
If you look at an old county map, you can actually see these visible jogs in the roads every few miles. Sometimes they're half a mile wide. It's where the lines had to abruptly correct their alignment to account for the curvature of the Earth and the convergence of the meridians.
So you can actually see the flaw in the ground.
You can drive it. It is a visible, physical manifestation of a flawed utopian premise. The perfect system requires constant, awkward, real-world patching.
So if an idealized grid required these physical corrections, what happens when you combine grand designs with uncontrolled human self-interest? We see that chaos just erupt during the land rush that created Oklahoma City.
Oklahoma City is a profound example of a miniature functional dystopia. It was born overnight in 1889, fueled by this rapid, uncoordinated self-interest. Settlers, including the infamous Sooners who snuck in early, were so maniacally focused on plotting out their own personal land parcels for immediate private use.
For their own tents, their own shop.
Yes, they claimed every single square inch available. They were maximizing their individual gain at the expense of the collective system.
And the result was chaos.
Exactly. They were grabbers, not urban planners. The consequence was catastrophic for the new city's functioning. They left no critical negative space, no land reserved for streets, alleys, plazas, or any basic municipal infrastructure.
So no roads.
The sources describe a city built literally tent flap to tent flap overnight. The lack of any systemic planning for the collective good meant they had to go back later and literally bulldoze structures just to create roads. It imposed massive friction and cost simply because this mass individual optimization was allowed to run completely rampant.
Then you have the other side of the coin, the problem of scale. This is exemplified by Salt Lake City, which used the Mormon-designed Plat of Zion template.
Right. The Plat of Zion, which was designed by Joseph Smith, called for massive, square, uniform city blocks and tremendously wide streets, originally 132 feet wide.
That's enormous.
It is. And the intention was good. It was intended to promote community and health, allowing ample space for homes and gardens. But modern urban planners now look at it and observe that this massive scale is simply boring, and it actively discourages the kind of vibrant urban life you find elsewhere.
Why does that size create friction for pedestrians? What's the mechanism there?
Well, large blocks reduce the potential points of interaction and choice for a pedestrian. Think about the smaller, short blocks you find in places like New York or Portland.
They're always turning a corner, seeing something new.
Exactly. You turn corners more often, you encounter more businesses, and you interact with the urban environment more frequently. But those 132-foot-wide streets in Salt Lake City force pedestrians to walk immense distances just to cross an intersection. It creates a measurable friction that's imposed by the utopian design itself.
And the practical fix they adopted for this is, it's a perfect symbol of grand design failure.
It is genuinely comical, but so illustrative. The quick fix for this flaw is placing little buckets filled with bright orange flags at the street corner.
You're kidding.
Not at all. Pedestrians are expected to grab a flag, carry it across the incredibly wide intersection for visibility, and then place it in the bucket on the other side. This cheap, immediate mitigation just highlights that the original design, which was intended for religious and community purity, failed dramatically to account for basic pedestrian human scale and safety needs and the destruction of community.
That same tension between a beautiful, optimized utopian vision and a messy reality played out again and again, especially in the 20th century with the rise of car culture. I mean, General Motors' 1939 World's Fair Vision Futurama, that was the ultimate system design fantasy.
Oh, it was a beautiful fantasy, a completely car-centric future with perfectly rationalized infrastructure. You had wide roads, sweeping ramps, total control over traffic flow.
And this wasn't just a fantasy, it got real political traction.
It did, especially after World War II. It was championed by leaders, many of whom had military experience, who viewed these massive, fast infrastructure projects as, well, the pinnacle of efficiency and the undisputed path forward for national growth.
The goal was to bridge cities, connect the country, create economic dynamism. But the unintended social consequences of that optimization they were immediate and severe.
The sheer scale of these projects had profound social side effects. We saw neighborhood destruction, the creation of traffic-clogged arteries, and massive environmental impacts. And the sources are very clear on this. While rural areas in the new suburbs benefited immensely from this network of rapid transit, the cost was overwhelmingly paid by the inner cities.
And specifically, who paid the highest price? Who in the inner cities?
The freeways were strategically routed through areas where land acquisition was cheapest and political opposition was weakest.
I think I know where this is going.
It means they were overwhelmingly built, and I'm quoting, at the expense of poor and marginalized communities. These massive concrete ribbons created lasting, visible divisions in urban centers, often physically separating ethnic or socioeconomic groups and causing lasting damage to local economies and ecologies.
Which is why the citizen resistance, like the work of Jane Jacobs, is so central to this discussion.
Jacobs' famous fight against the construction of highways in New York, saving parts of Lower Manhattan from Robert Moses's planned Interstate 78, is a crucial historical counterpoint.
She was fighting the system.
She was. And her fight demonstrates that the centralized pursuit of engineering efficiency, which sees people and communities as mere obstacles to be routed around, often utterly fails to account for the value of local human ecologies and complex established social systems. She argued that the local knowledge of the residents should take precedence over the efficiency models of the planners.
It's a continuous cycle, isn't it? And now cities are actually attempting to undo the errors of that past optimization. Barcelona is a fascinating modern example of this.
It is. Barcelona's example grid, which looks so geometrically pleasing, ironically proved to be the perfect template for car domination.
How so?
It featured wide, straight streets and a very distinctive feature-chamfered corners where the intersections were cut diagonally. That design, which was intended to provide more light and air, ended up making intersections easier for drivers to navigate and see oncoming traffic. It just accelerated the noise and air pollution as traffic intensified over the decades.
So the very design that was meant to improve the city became its environmental downfall. How are they fixing this systemic error?
They're mitigating the damage by creating what they call super blocks. They're taking groupings of 3x3 existing blocks and drastically limiting or rerouting vehicular traffic entirely around the perimeter.
So they're taking back the streets.
They're reclaiming millions of square meters of previously car-centric space, turning them into pedestrian islands, shared streets, public plazas. The systemic acknowledgement here is vital. Past optimization prioritized vehicular efficiency over human health, and they are now using a new form of systemic design to prioritize public health, encouraging less sedentary lifestyles.
Okay, so if physical architecture shows the flaws in large-scale system design, then our concept of time shows how optimization can fundamentally distort human experience. It can introduce a kind of tyranny, the tyranny of the clock.
The history of timekeeping is really the history of relentlessly chasing mechanical precision. We started with, the Babylonian division of the day into 24 hours, monastery bells ringing canonical hours based on the solar rhythm, rudimentary sundials.
Very natural, very organic.
Right. But technological acceleration, starting with the Industrial Revolution, demanded an entirely new level of arbitrary synchronization.
And here's where that engineering principle of optimization directly intersects with human exploitation. The need for precise time became a tool of control.
Absolutely. As industrial engineering took hold in the 18th and 19th centuries, we saw the rapid introduction of these mammoth-sized machines capable of producing textiles and goods at astonishing speeds, miles per hour, as one source describes it.
And the old way of telling time just wasn't good enough anymore.
No, the old village system, where the public clock might only strike on the quarter hour, was utterly insufficient for managing factory flow and inventory.
This new need for rigid precision paved the way for the factory system, and the human cost was just immense.
Precision was instantly weaponized for managerial efficiency and, frankly, exploitation. Thousands of workers were forced to work 6 days a week, from dawn to dusk, for pay that couldn't keep up with inflation. The clock, which was once a benign observer of the day, became a tyrant, measuring and extracting every last ounce of efficiency from the worker.
The optimization of production required the simultaneous subjugation of human labor to the rigid mechanism of the machine.
Perfectly put. And even seemingly useful applications of standardized time created initial staggering chaos. Before we had a national standard, just coordinating travel was nearly impossible.
I read this in the source material. It's unbelievable.
The railroad era was a magnificent coordination crisis built on top of efficient transportation technology. You have to imagine a traveler having to reset their pocket watch 12 times just on a trip between New York and Boston before 1884.
12 times. It's insane.
The sheer mess of uncoordinated trains, which led to scheduling nightmares, missed connections, and horrific crashes, it necessitated a drastic, arbitrary intervention.
So, standardized time replaced local variable time with a rigid, uniform, though entirely invented convention.
Yes. The system replaced time that was connected to the actual solar cycle with a man-made artificial system of time zones. And this arbitrary grid now dictates our schedules, synchronizes global markets, and even governs our body rhythms, forcing us to abide by conventions that were simply created for the efficient scheduling of trains and factory shifts. The moral application of engineering principles.
This relentless efficiency, it leads us to the darkest manifestation of the efficiency trap. The idea that a methodology designed to solve problems and optimize systems can be morally neutral, yet terrifyingly effective when it's applied to morally repugnant goals.
This is perhaps the most difficult realization in our source material. The engineering mindset itself is ruthless in its pursuit of efficiency, regardless of the objective.
And the example is just chilling.
Our sources provide the chilling example of Hitler's engineers who employed core engineering principles specifically to commit genocide.
How exactly did that engineering mindset manifest in such a destructive way? What were they doing?
It was pure optimization for villainy. They designed reliable ovens, ensuring consistency and throughput. They focused on optimizing human genetics according to a perverse standard of gene quality. They used standardization to quickly build concentration camps across a massive geographical area.
And tracking.
And they implemented meticulous tracking systems for inmates, treating human beings as inventory packages moving through a systemic process.
That just demonstrates that the methodology of maximum efficiency, unfortunately, it does work in practice, even for morally abhorrent ends. The danger lies in the inherent neutrality of the process itself.
Precisely. And this chilling realization that methodology is morally neutral applies equally to our most mundane modern technologies, too. I mean, consider the cell phone. It promised liberation, but delivered tethering and vulnerability.
The cell phone was created to offer the ultimate freedom of mobility. That was the sales pitch.
But the reverse effect is profound societal obligation. People are now inextricably tied to their jobs, their communication demands, their social networks. It's dramatically blurring the lines separating work, family, and personal life.
There's no escape.
The efficiency of instant communication means the possibility of escape or distance has been minimized.
And the tracking capabilities are a perfect example of this double-edged sword.
Oh, absolutely. Location-enabled technologies are designed to augment public security, making emergency services more efficient, for example. Yet, the same systems simultaneously fuel stalking and state surveillance. Every feature designed for convenience introduces a reciprocal vulnerability or a new form of control.
And that seems to be a core reason technological progress tends toward dystopia.
I think so. The tools of liberation are also the tools of surveillance, obligation, and personal constraint.
Okay, moving to a more subtle systemic failure. Let's look at how efficiency impacts our psychology, specifically through the lens of annoyance. Annoyance is a fundamental human response to unpleasantness, especially when our plans, or even our brain's predictive models, are thwarted.
We define annoyance as a biological conflict that arises from thwarted expectations. This can be anything from a delayed flight to complicated bureaucratic forms to what psychologists label social allergens.
Social allergens, I like that. Little irritations.
Minor, repeated irritations caused by others. And technology, which was designed for smoothness, has become a relentless generator of these social allergens.
It has. The supreme annoyance of the half-log, hearing only one side of a cell phone conversation in a public space, is the perfect example. People hate this far more than they hate overhearing a full conversation.
Which is so interesting.
And it's not simply the noise. It's a cognitive struggle, isn't it?
It frustrates our brain's intense, fundamental effort to predict and make sense of the world. Our brains are constantly engaged in probabilistic prediction. What will the speaker say next? Where's this going?
But you can't predict.
When you only hear half a conversation, there is insufficient context, and the brain is constantly frustrated in its attempt to anticipate and complete the circuit. Annoyance, in this case, is a powerful reaction against uncertainty and thwarted predictive capability.
This psychological drive to mitigate uncertainty is so strong that studies show we often prefer known pain over ambiguity.
That's a crucial finding. The greater the level of uncertainty, the more stress participants experience. We have an evolved psychological preference for certainty, even if that certainty is negative.
Which helps explain why designers sometimes utterly fail to account for fundamental human perception. They're focused purely on technical efficiency.
Like the famous non-functional elevator button.
Oh, this is a great story.
It's a perfect teaching moment. The designers of Terminal 5 at Heathrow discovered that users panicked when they entered an elevator that only went to one floor via a direct lift because the users didn't feel they had any control.
So they put in a fake button.
They retrofitted an entirely non-functional UP button. Even though it did nothing to change the technical process, the presence of the button provided the necessary human ritual of control, and it prevented panic.
So the technology was optimized for speed, but it failed because it didn't account for the human need for the illusion of agency.
Exactly. And this also applies to the failure of high-tech devices like Google Glass. The sources suggest its failure wasn't purely technical, but deeply social. It didn't account for human perception, specifically the critical importance of eye gaze in communication.
You couldn't see people's eyes.
And by obscuring the eyes, the technology violated a fundamental social norm that signals our mood, our intent, the nature of the relationship. Optimal performance, zero social intelligence. The system failed because it ignored the user's social context.
We've talked about systems built in the physical world and systems built in time. Now, we move to the ultimate system we are learning to engineer, life itself. This section highlights how the pursuit of optimization in biology leads directly to ethical crises and, well, potential biological dystopias.
This revolution was really launched by the gene splicing breakthrough achieved by Cohen and Boyer in 1973, the ability to perform recombinant DNA surgery.
Okay.
And this was quickly followed by the creation of trans-species hybrids, or chimeras. To be clear, these are life forms that are genetically blended in a way that means they cannot breed or evolve naturally in the wild.
This represents a fundamental shift, doesn't it? We're moving beyond natural selection and into deliberate artificial selection on a molecular level. We're truly embracing the title of remanufacturers of life.
And the results, driven by that search for efficiency, were immediate and startling. We created super animals designed for maximal market efficiency and yield. For example, Australian pigs were engineered to be 30% more efficient at converting feed to muscle.
Which means what in practice?
It means they reached market 7 weeks earlier. Sheep were made to grow 30% faster. It's all about speed and yield.
The ultimate example of crossing a biological line, though, came in 1983.
The famous super mice, yes. Researchers inserted human growth hormone genes into mouse embryos. These mice grew twice as fast and twice as large as normal mice.
And the critical part.
The critical part is that they passed the engineered trait to their offspring. This was the moment we demonstrated the power not just to modify existing life, but to create a new, thriving species that was fundamentally and permanently different from its biological origins.
This capability fuels an almost audacious goal regarding the future of humanity and the planet.
The audacity is astounding. The ultimate goal, as stated in our sources, is becoming the remanufacturers of life and materials on Earth. There's even talk of potentially terraforming Venus and Mars to suit human desires and needs.
Which must create a crisis for some people.
A huge philosophical crisis for humanists who traditionally found meaning and ethical grounding in nature's cycles, in the notion of life arising spontaneously in a balance we could not control. We are declaring sovereignty over the natural world at the most fundamental level. Technology reinforcing inequality and conflict.
And that utopian promise of a better life quickly slams into the dystopian reality of socioeconomic division and conflict.
The central concern here is that genetic enhancement for non-disease traits, for traits that merely provide a competitive advantage, will result in a biological reinforcement of existing socioeconomic and class distinctions.
So how does money translate directly into biological advantage today? Is this already happening?
Oh, yes. Consider the market for human growth hormone. It was originally intended to treat children with dwarfism, but its use quickly expanded for non-disease enhancement. It now generates $500 million in sales annually. If parents can afford to pay for enhancements to make their children taller, faster, or potentially smarter, those children gain a competitive biological advantage. Gene therapy and enhancement will overwhelmingly benefit those able to pay for it.
Leading to a biologically stratified society.
Where the rich are literally genetically superior to the poor, that is the dystopian fear.
And this technological capability quickly became militarized, turning optimization into a full-blown arms race during the Cold War.
The biological arms race escalated significantly in the 1980s. This was driven largely by intense fears that the Soviet Union was already exploring advanced genetic engineering for military purposes.
So the U.S. had to respond.
The U.S. responded by rapidly expanding its defensive biological warfare research. This meant genetic engineers were cloning massive quantities of traditional pathogens and, crucially, inventing new designer agents.
What made these new designer agents so terrifyingly efficient?
They could be created quickly and cheaply in laboratories. They could be tailored to bypass existing immunities or traditional countermeasures. Conversely, developing antidotes or vaccines to these novel agents might take decades.
That asymmetry.
The cheap, fast, efficient offense versus the slow, expensive, inefficient defense, is the classic signature of a high-stakes dystopian scenario.
And on a social level, we see deep division over even the simplest life modification, epitomized by the Frankenfood controversy.
Social opposition to genetically modified crops remains intensely fierce, particularly in Europe and parts of Asia. And this isn't just a regulatory debate.
No, it's visceral.
Activists have set fire to suspected GM fields, and some Supreme Courts have upheld strict bans. This reaction, this profound societal division over the ethics of altering food and nature, demonstrates how technology can create intense cultural and political fault lines, even over something as basic and necessary as what we eat. The risk of altering what we don't understand.
This entire section brings us to a profound, almost tragic irony about the biotech revolution.
The irony is this. We are acquiring the scientific and technical power to alter our genetics, and even the underpinnings of our ethical inclinations, more dramatically than ever before, precisely at the moment we are just beginning to understand the deep genetic roots of those inclinations.
So we have reached peak intervention capability, but perhaps minimum necessary wisdom.
That's the danger. We gain the capability to change fundamental aspects of life, the genetic basis of our biology, and possibly our behavior, which we don't yet fully understand. It means we run the enormous risk of doing what we have mistakenly done throughout history, only at a much larger scale. Upsetting the finely tuned balance of nature, suffering devastating, unforeseen consequences, and then desperately scrambling to fix our own errors. That cycle of intervention, realization, suffering, and scrambling defines human technological hubris.
Okay, so we've established that external systems, cities, clocks, genes, tend toward dystopia because of unintended consequences or moral misuse. But the failure is truly cemented by our internal settings. Our human psychological defaults are fundamentally not set for a perfect, selfless utopia.
We have to begin with a cold biological truth, which can be explained through the selfish gene principle. The world of nature, where evolution operates, is one of constant competition and exploitation.
Right.
Genes for overindulgence or behaviors that exploit the system are swiftly punished by nature, often resulting in death or failure to reproduce because there is no safety net. There's no welfare state in nature.
But when society attempts to create a welfare state, a highly desirable, ethical, yet profoundly unnatural system, it introduces a massive systemic conflict with that basic biological programming.
The source material is starkly Malthusian here. It argues that if society chooses to institute the welfare state, a mechanism that counters natural selective pressure, it must also implement what the source calls unnatural birth control. Without control over population growth, the result of supporting those who would otherwise fail to thrive is ultimately greater aggregate misery than what you see in nature, because unchecked propagation overwhelms the available resources. This just demonstrates how even large, beneficent social systems conflict directly with our fundamental biological programming for self-interest and reproduction, the inevitability of self-interest and conformity.
Beyond biological selfishness, our species has an astonishingly powerful drive to conform, which seems counterintuitive for a species that depends on radical innovation.
Social learning and the transmission of culture require this dynamic tension between crowds of conformists and the rare innovator. But the deep-seated drive in primates, which you can see even in chimpanzees to conform, stems from an intense, evolved urge to belong.
It's a survival mechanism.
It is. When you're faced with uncertainty, it's safer and more efficient to just adopt the most commonly perceived responses in the population.
And this means that even if the rare innovator finds the perfect, non-dystopian, optimal solution, the conformist impulse works actively against its adoption.
Precisely. This instinct was adapted for survival in a homogeneous wilderness, where sticking to the group offered efficiency and safety. But this evolved instinct is now stressed in our modern, globalized, multiracial, polyglot society.
How so?
The drive to conform becomes a mechanism that actively resists difference and diversity. It leads to psychological resistance and unnecessary conflict against new, beneficial ideas that just look or feel different.
This inherent resistance to newness leads us to the political utility of generating uncertainty in others, which is a key part of maintaining the status quo.
We frequently see the failure of what's called the information deficit model. This model is often employed by scientists, for instance, those trying to convince the public of climate change, by providing more data, more complex graphs, more scientific facts.
Thinking that more information will lead to more understanding.
But paradoxically, this massive influx of information, rather than building understanding, often increases the public's patient stress and fear arising from uncertainty.
Why does receiving more information sometimes make people more fearful?
Because the public still lacks the necessary context of how the problem personally affects them, or how they can act. They're just bombarded with raw data, but left unable to predict their future or navigate the complex systems being described. The efficiency of data delivery clashes with the psychological need for meaningful understanding.
Finally, we are fighting against the fundamental structure of our own brains when we try to change direction or escape a flawed system. Our minds prioritize efficiency in thought through these entrenched pathways.
Repeated experience forms deep psychological structures we call attractor-like states, or reflex arcs. You can think of them as deep, familiar grooves carved into the mind, like a well-worn road.
This is efficient for daily tasks, right? Like driving home on autopilot.
Incredibly efficient. But the trade-off is rigidity. If you are in a state of urgency, stress, or harassment, your mind is, and I'm quoting here, condemned to follow its familiar channels. It inhibits the ability to think intuitively or creatively about a new solution.
So change becomes difficult not because of external barriers, but because your brain defaults to what is known, no matter how painful or ineffective that familiar path might be.
Exactly. And we see that cognitive paralysis in extreme human distress as well.
Such as?
Depression and profound existential distress, particularly at the end of life, exhibit the hallmarks of a hyperactive default network. The default mode network, or DMN, is the brain system responsible for inward focus, self-reflection, and mental planning.
And when it's hyperactive?
When it's hyperactive, this leads to obsessive self-reflection and an inability to escape deepening negative thinking grooves. The mind is painfully stuck in a feedback loop.
So the ego, facing the ultimate uncertainty of mortality, turns inward and becomes hypervigilant.
Absolutely. The ego, facing extinction, becomes hypervigilant and turns inward, resulting in rumination and worry. This deepening negative thinking groove is a massive psychological vulnerability that technology can potentially exploit or intensify.
How would it do that?
Think of systems that encourage constant inward-focused self-reflection or algorithmic feeds that confirm negative self-bias. The difficulty of breaking these internal cycles ensures that even when a better, non-dystopian path is obvious, following the known, if painful, cognitive channel just feels safer. This is the ultimate psychological underpinning for systemic failure.
This comprehensive deep dive brings us to a central, unified finding about the persistent tendency toward dystopia. It arises not merely from individual malice or bad political intentions, but from the systemic and inevitable interaction between large-scale optimization and our deeply rooted, often contradictory human psychological limitations.
We saw the peril in optimizing time, which led to exploitation. We saw it in optimizing urban infrastructure, which led to division and environmental damage. And optimizing biology, which reinforces socioeconomic inequality.
And all of these engineered systems.
All of these engineered systems clash powerfully with our intrinsic desire for certainty, our conformist impulses, and our self-serving genetics.
So what's the constructive way forward? I mean, if the aggressive drive for raw efficiency is what leads us into these systemic dead ends, where should our innovative energy be focused instead?
The most important technological advances, as suggested by our sources, are those that actively challenge our assumptions and expand our space of possibility, rather than just making existing tasks easier or faster.
That's a key distinction.
It is. The best technologies are not about shaving milliseconds off a process. They are about making the invisible visible, forcing us to integrate new realities and think fundamentally differently about our constraints.
That distinction, making things faster versus helping us see new realities, is critical if we want to escape these entrenched, painful cognitive grooves.
We have to embrace a continuous cycle of creativity followed by efficiency, constantly introducing new ideas that destabilize the familiar and avoid settling into those rigid, attractor-like states of thought. True innovation happens not in efficiency, but in the disruptive movement between those two modes.
And that leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, the learner. We discussed memory systems and annoyance, and we noted that a person with severe hippocampus damage, meaning they can't form new conscious declarative memories, would still become profoundly annoyed by a repeatedly crying baby.
The reason is fascinating. Even without the conscious declarative recall of the past events, that baby cried yesterday, they build up an implicit, non-declarative emotional response. They feel the mounting annoyance and emotional distress, even if they don't consciously know why.
So here's the question. If technology is increasingly designed to optimize our environment, to prevent annoyance and smooth our experiences, to give us absolute friction-free smoothness, are we risking losing that valuable, non-declarative emotional learning that shapes our character and our resilience? What is the true cost of absolute smoothness if it prevents us from developing necessary implicit emotional character and wisdom?
That's something to ponder as you look at the engineered systems and technologies that strive to make your world frictionless today.